Does truth exist?
Because you have faith, does that make this book true?
Does God exist?
So when someone says there is no truth, if you apply the claim to itself, what should you say? Is that true? They don't think Christianity's true. They're talked out of it. You know why they're talked out of it? Because they've never been talked into it.
Cross-examining skeptical and atheistic views.
Hey guys, welcome to another brand new episode of SAFT podcast. And I guess you might have noticed the difference with how the way that we began the podcast. Normally, as you know, we start with a good music playing for some 10-15 seconds. But this intro is very catchy and something that I end up hearing quite often. And you will be hearing the voice that you heard just now in this intro for most of the 40-30 minutes of this podcast, as we have the one and only Dr. Frank Turek joining us on SAFT podcast. Dr. Frank, it's an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on SAFT podcast.
Jacob, thank you for having me on. Glad to be on.
Yes, absolutely. I must say that you are one of the most prominent apologists and thinkers who has deeply impacted me in my study of apologetics and as I advance the gospel to my friends.
Very good. Well, I'm happy that the ministry has made an impact on you and anybody else there in India. It's a wonderful group of Christians there. I know you have millions of Christians actually in India. So I'm glad that we could, in our small way, try and help Christians and even maybe unbelievers become Christians there. So,
Frank, how long have you been engaged with apologetics? And I'm not talking about starting with cross-examine ministry or starting your role as speaker, but for how long have you been interacting with this field of Christian apologetics?
Well, I came to faith trusting in Jesus because of apologetics. I always believed in God. I just didn't know who Jesus was. And I was told to get Josh McDowell books. Evidence That Demands a Verdict is one of them, and More Than a Carpenter is another. And that was back in the 1980s. So that's like, say, 35 years ago, I was reading those books. And I came to faith by reading those books. And then when I had an opportunity to get into apologetics back in the early 1990s, I did. I met Dr. Norman Geisler, and we moved our family to Charlotte, North Carolina here in the United States, and went to seminary under Dr. Geisler. And that's when I had the opportunity to write a couple of books with him. In fact, one of them was called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist.
Awesome. So you also served as an aviator. How was that experience?
Well, I was in the Navy right after college, and that's how I actually learned more about Jesus, because I met the son of a Methodist minister when I was in flight school, and he was the one that told me to get Josh McDowell books. So I actually became a Christian when I was in the Navy, and then when I got out of the Navy, that's when we went to seminary.
Awesome. And you've done your master's and your PhD in apologetics, so it would have been a completely different shift from being in the Navy to being an apologist.
Yeah, actually, I earned a D-Min, which is a Doctor of Ministry. So it was a real practical doctorate. But yeah, I earned it here at Southern Evangelical Seminary, ses.edu. Anyone can go to that website. You can even take courses there online. It's a great place to take courses. We also teach courses at crossexamine.org as well.
Yeah, the online courses, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So, Frank, as I hinted to you earlier, we are bringing out this podcast specifically because John Loftus is bringing out a new book titled The Case Against Miracles. And Lee Strobel had done a book on the case for miracles. So this time, John Loftus' work is actually a collaboration of multiple essays. He has edited the essays, and Michael Shermer is writing the foreword for it. And people like Bart Ehrman and all are building up the pace for the book to get it to the maximum audience. And so when this point of miracles is very critical to the Christian faith, as you yourself admit it in multiple occasions where you speak. So to kick it off, what is a miracle? Because in this case, defining a miracle is very critical. So how would you define a miracle as?
I would define a miracle as a overpowering of a natural law by a being, say, outside the universe. A supernatural event, not a natural event, but a supernatural event where God, say, resurrects the dead. That would be a miracle, the crowning miracle of Christianity. But as I argue, people who don't believe in miracles, I often say to them, look around, you're living in a miracle because this universe is a miracle. The greatest miracle in the Bible is not the resurrection. It's Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So we actually have evidence from science and philosophy that the first verse of the Bible is true. Even atheistic scientists are admitting that space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing. Now, as you know, Jacob, they don't think it's God that created space, time, and matter out of nothing. Right. But think about it. If space, time, and matter literally had a beginning out of nothing, which the atheists are admitting, what else could it be? It's got to be a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent creator. Because if space, time, and matter had a beginning, it's got to be beyond space, time, and matter. It's got to be something that's spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, and also intelligent in order to make a choice. So it can't be another natural event. It's got to be some sort of supernatural cause, not a natural cause, because nature was created. So it's got to be something beyond nature, something we'd call supernatural. And if that's the case, then if Genesis 1:1 is true, if God does actually exist, then miracles are possible, and he can raise the dead, walk on water, part the Red Sea. Any of these miracles you see in the Bible are at least possible if the first verse of the Bible is true.
So to reiterate, your definition of miracle would be anything that is supernatural, beyond the natural explanations, and brought forward by a supernatural being.
Yes, it would be something that only God could do. If nature left to itself, nature would just continue to do what it does, but something beyond nature could intervene in the natural world and create an effect that goes beyond nature, like resurrecting the dead or walking on water or parting the Red Sea. These are things that nature alone can't do.
So, Frank, I believe that you're absolutely familiar with Hume's definition of the miracles, where he said that a miracle by definition is a violation of the laws of nature.
Let me say something about that, Jacob, because that's
up until that part, how much do you? Yeah.
That's a philosophical claim, a violation of the laws of nature. That's assuming that the laws of nature can't be violated. Well, that's silly. We violate the laws of nature every day. When we go up in an airplane, we are overpowering. We're not really violating. We're just overpowering the laws of nature. We're using the laws of nature to overpower the laws of nature. We're using aerodynamics to overpower gravity. Now, if we can overpower gravity, can the creator of gravity overpower gravity? That would seem to me, of course. So I think Hume's definition is fundamentally flawed of what a miracle is. It's not a violation of anything. It is simply an overpowering of the natural order of events. And if we as agents can overpower natural events, why can't the creator of those natural laws overpower those natural laws?
Right. And actually what Hume does is he actually gives into an a priori commitment where he believes that miracles can't happen because miracles don't happen. He actually begs the question with his definition.
Yeah, so, he does. And it's a circular argument. Okay.
So Frank, one part that you explain right now is just the example of us traveling in an airplane, overpowering gravity. But since that happens very commonly and usually, we won't categorize it as a miracle. Am I right?
Of course not. No, that's a natural agent just using the laws of nature to overpower other laws of nature. And we would need these laws of nature to do what they do routinely and consistently in order for us to identify an unusual event like a miracle. If you don't have the backdrop of regular events, there's no way you can identify a special event. If the natural laws didn't do what they did over and over again, you wouldn't be able to identify what a miracle was. So natural laws and the fact that natural laws routinely do what they do, and there aren't many miracles, that's what you need in order for a miracle to get your attention. I mean, I often, a lot of people will say they don't believe in miracles because they've never seen one. And I say, well, you shouldn't expect to see many miracles, because if miracles occurred routinely, we'd say, hey, these are just kind of natural events. These things happen all the time. There's got to be some sort of natural explanation for them. But if a resurrection occurs very infrequently, then it can get your attention. I mean, if resurrections occurred all the time, the resurrection of Jesus would mean nothing, right? You go to somebody, you go, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. The guy might say, well, so what? Uncle Jason just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back. No, it's got to be a rare event, a miracle, in order to get our attention. And people like David Hume actually criticize miracles for being rare events, when in fact, if they weren't rare events, if they were regular events, we wouldn't consider them miracles. So they have to be rare in order to get our attention.
So what would be the probability of a miracle that you would ascertain to happen on a daily basis? Like if someone comes to you and says that they've experienced 5 miracles in a day, keeping aside what sort of miracle they were, if they would, so to say, that they had 5 miracles in a day, what would be your initial response?
I would be, show me the evidence, because all miracle claims need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So you have to look at each miracle claim and look at the evidence for them. And obviously in New Testament times, when the New Testament apostles were being confirmed by the miracles that they did, they may have done 5 miracles in a day. Does that happen today? Not frequently, if it does, although Craig Keener, I don't know if you've heard that name, Jacob, Keener, Keener, has written a wonderful hernia-inducing 2-volume set on miracles, where he looks into modern-day miracles. And he thinks modern-day miracles have occurred, and I think he's right, they have. But let me say this. Miracles, there doesn't have to be any miracles since Jesus and the apostles for Christianity to be true. If there have been no miracles since Jesus and the apostles, Christianity is still true. Now, I think there have been miracles since then, but you don't need them to show that Christianity is true. Christianity is true if the resurrection occurred. You don't need modern day miracles to show that Christianity is true.
Right. And one critical, I would say, sort of an argument point where Christianity is cornered up, especially the common man is cornered up, is when we sort of read God into the equations of natural happenings. So the earlier the skeptics would say, well, earlier people would look at lightnings and say that was God intervening and would read God into it. But now they accuse us of committing post ad hoc fallacy, where we equivocate 2 unrelated events. So how do we see coincidences that are merely coincidence and God's interventions that are miracles happening when we come across certain events? How do we rationally sieve out the coincidence from miracles?
Well, what they're arguing is what's called a God of the gaps argument. And it's true that many people have made mistakes attributing, say, thunder and lightning to God. The gods are mad at us. And we've since learned, well, there's a natural explanation for thunder and lightning. But when it comes to a miracle is something in a spiritual context that points to truth, points to God. So Jesus predicts his resurrection and then he accomplishes it. It's predicted beforehand and he accomplishes it, and he overcomes one of the greatest problems we have, or the ultimate problem we have, and that's death. So a miracle is something that points to truth. And in some cases, it's even predicted, as was the resurrection. In fact, if you look at the miracles of Jesus, they're in 4 categories, and they correspond to the 4 categories of trouble that human beings have. The first category is sin. Sin hurts us. The second category is nature. Nature can hurt us, natural disasters. The third category is sickness. Obviously, when we get sick, that can hurt us as well. And the fourth category is death. Death is our ultimate problem. Now, when you look at the 35 or so miracles of Jesus, they are in those 4 categories. First of all, Jesus is sinless. That's pretty miraculous if you think about it, because none of us are sinless. Why? A natural law has not been overpowered. Our nature is to sin, and we sin from birth. But Jesus didn't sin, so he overpowers sin. Secondly, he overpowers nature. He can calm the storm. He can walk on water. And then he can also, thirdly, overpower sickness. He heals the sick. And finally, he overpowers death. He comes back to life after being dead, and he can raise other people from the dead. What's Jesus saying by these miracles? He's the Messiah. He's the Savior. He can right the wrongs and problems that we have in this life. He can overcome sin. He can overcome nature. He can overcome sickness, and he can overcome death. Now, that's not a God of the gaps argument. It's not just that we lack a natural explanation for why Jesus can heal sick people or calm the storm or overpower death. It's when someone can calm the storm, when someone can heal the sick, when someone can overpower death, that's positive evidence for an intelligent being like God. We don't just lack a natural explanation. Nature left to itself, nature will hurt us. Nature will get us sick. Nature will cause us to die. Jesus overpowers all that. So we have positive evidence for an intelligent divine being when we look at miracles like that.
Right. And Frank, you said that miracles need to point out to truth. So then if you take that into account, not only should a miracle be an overpowering of natural law, but it must point to a higher truth for it to be categorized as a miracle, right?
Normally, there may be exceptions, but when you look at what happens, say, and this distinguishes between a miracle and, say, a satanic sign. And in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, we go through 6 different types of unusual events. 2 of them are what we just mentioned, a miracle, and the other is a satanic sign. A satanic sign is not going to point to truth. It's going to point away from truth. It's trying to get you away from God. It's trying to get you away from Jesus. Whereas a true miracle points you to Jesus and points you to God and to truth.
All right. So when we say that a true miracle must point to Jesus, and this would be connecting to the next question of what do we do with miracles from other worldviews, other religions. So when we say that a true miracle should point to Jesus, are we defining true miracles in a way that true miracles can only be the ones that point to Jesus? Are we defining miracles to be without any opposition?
No, I think what we need to do when people say, what about miracles in other world religions? We need to look at them. We need to look and see if there's evidence for them, and which way do they point? Is there good evidence for, say, miracles in Islam, for example? And actually, even Muslim apologists will admit that the miracles attributed to Muhammad are attributed to him 150 years after he's died in the Hadith.
Right.
Muhammad does no miracles in the Quran. In fact, he says, I don't do miracles. I'm just a plain warner. I just warn people there's one God. So if Muhammad did do miracles, it would contradict the Quran. So you have to look at miracles on a case-by-case basis. You have to be open enough to say, well, let's look at the evidence. Is the evidence there? And I think when you look at the evidence for miracles within world religions, and as I say, you don't need a miracle today to show that Christianity is true. When you look at the historical evidence for the miracles of Jesus, I think it stands head and shoulders above anything else from any other worldview.
Exactly. So how can one rationally analyze a miracle? And the reason I am asking this question is, like I said, most often people read into incidents as miracles. For example, given the definition that we have about miracles, a resurrection would categorize as a miracle because that overpowers the natural law. About someone being delivered from cancer, does that account as a miracle?
It depends. It could be natural laws taking their course. It could be a miracle. It could be divine providence. See, let me just list real quickly. We don't have time to discuss all of them, but let me list the 6 types of unusual events. Right. Magic, sleight of hand, right? Anomalies, which you can't explain naturally right now, but there is a natural explanation. Another would be satanic signs. We mentioned that already. Another would be psychosomatic. People have been cured by just changing their thinking on something because they had a psychosomatic disease, right? The 5th one is called divine providence. That's when God is involved, but he doesn't overpower a natural law. And the sixth is, of course, a miracle where God does overpower natural law. Quite frequently, Christians will confuse the last two and call them miracles. Divine providence is not a miracle. God's not overpowering a natural law. He may have prearranged events, so God is involved, but he's not overpowering a natural law. Like some people will say, well, it's a miracle that I met my wife. And I'll say, no, it might have been divine providence that God prearranged natural events so that you meet your wife, but it wasn't a miracle that you met her unless she walked across the lake on the way to meet you, right? On top of the lake. Now that would be a miracle. Okay. But no, it's divine providence. God is involved, but he's not overpowering a natural law.
So with the same logic, when we look at the parting of the Red Sea, would you categorize as a divine providence or a miracle? Because isn't it, now I'm going to take a point of a devil's advocate for a moment. Yeah. Isn't it possible that there could have been a strong wind that blew at that particular time that just happened to part the Red Sea? What would you say to that?
Well, actually, that's what the text says, that God caused a strong, I think, east wind to come up, which parted the Red Sea. But in that context, where, okay, the Israelites are up against the sea and they're about to be obliterated by Pharaoh's army, and Moses gestures to part the Red Sea and it happens, that really seems to be an act of God, not just a natural law, even though God may have used natural processes for it to happen. And then they get through the sea, and then the wind stops and it closes in on Pharaoh's army. That just seems a little bit too coincidental to be just a coincidence, right? that would be tautology there. It's a coincidence to be a coincidence. You get the idea. It seems to be designed. All right. It seems to be designed. So yeah, God can use natural processes to perform his supernatural events directly. But say the difference between divine providence and a miracle would be like, say, the fog at Normandy. In 1944, the Allies had to assault Europe to rescue the European continent from the Nazis. And fog rolled in at the right time at Normandy to at least partially obscure the Allied attack on the Nazis. Now, fog happens all the time. What's that?
Was that on the D-Day?
Yeah, on D-Day, exactly. Fog happens all the time, but it happened at the right time in the right place at an unusual time in June. And it may not have been a miracle. God is not overpowering a natural law because fog does happen all the time. But it seemed to occur at the right place in the right time for a reason. And it wasn't a miracle in the sense that he overpowered a natural law. It would have been a miracle if the Allied forces had assaulted the beach and the bullets bounced off their chests, right? That would have been a miracle. Or they walked across the water on the way into Normandy. That would have been a miracle. It wasn't a miracle in that sense. It was more like divine providence.
Right. And I truly believe that distinction between divine providence and miracle is very key, because here in the eastern part, there is a very high tendency for us to confuse up divine providence and miracles. Now, before we move on to the next part, Dr. Frank, what is the fault if someone mixes up that divine providence and miracle? Is someone missing out on anything?
Well, I mean, if it was supposed to be a miracle and you just thought it was divine providence, I guess it depends on what the issue is. In both cases, God is involved. But in the case of divine providence, he's not overpowering a natural law. In the case of a miracle, he is. So I guess it really depends on the context. But let me say one other thing that we haven't gotten to yet, Jason, which I think is really important. And you have these atheists writing books, The Case Against Miracles. Do you realize that everyone believes in at least one miracle? I mean, atheists believe in miracles. They believe in the miracle that the universe created itself out of nothing, right? That there was nothing, and then the entire space-time continuum popped into existence out of nothing. Lawrence Krauss, a famous atheist here in the United States, has written a book on this. I responded to his book in my book, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. And he's trying to claim that the universe exploded into being out of nothing by nothing. Now, his nothing is not really nothing. It's a quantum vacuum.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
something. But he's still trying to make the claim that things can pop into existence out of nothing. Well, that takes a lot more faith than believing that someone created the universe out of nothing, rather than no one created the universe out of nothing. Atheists believe in a miracle that takes a lot more faith, a lot more incredulity than just somebody who says that God, a self-existing being who created all things and sustains all things, created the universe out of nothing. Look, there's only two possibilities at the end of the day, and that is either mind gave rise to matter or matter gave rise to mind. That's it.
Right.
And well, you can boil all worldviews down to one of those two options. Mind gave rise to matter, or matter gave rise to mind. Well, matter giving rise to mind doesn't make any sense because A, matter is not eternal. Matter had a beginning. B, matter is composed, which means somebody had to put it together. It's made of parts. So it's not an eternal thing. The only eternal being could be a immaterial being, a spaceless, timeless, immaterial being, and that's what we mean by God. So mind gave rise to matter, and matter, of course, is just dead. It doesn't do anything unless it's animated by a mind. Like our brains are animated by a mind, and that's why we have a mind. Our minds are made in the image of the great mind. So everyone's believing in at least one miracle, and I think atheists have to have a lot more faith than Christians have to have. The other thing that's, I think, really important, and this should make sense in India, because people in India, as I would understand it, believe in the supernatural. They believe in the spiritual realm. And for atheism to be true, Jason, every single spiritual experience and miracle claim in the history of the world has to be mistaken, has to be false for atheism to be true. Now, is that possible? Sure, it's possible, but is it reasonable? No. It's much more reasonable to believe that there is a spiritual realm in order to explain the fact that there have been experiences of spiritual experiences, whether they're miracles or just the idea that there's something beyond me. That makes a lot more sense than atheism.
Right, and that's what normally what atheists do. They stand on the grounding of reason that can only be explained by God, and then use that to discredit miracles, and as such, they steal that standard from God. Yeah,
exactly. Someone should write a book on that.
So, Dr. Frank, before we move to the closing point of it, do you think there can be any scientific case that can be built for any miracles, anything throughout history?
Well, let me just say this, that first of all, science needs God. And I have an entire chapter in the book Stealing from God on this. Why do I say that? Because in order to do science, you need an orderly, consistent, precise, natural world of cause and effect. And that involves orderly, precise, natural laws, natural forces that do the same thing over and over again. We also need those natural forces, as I mentioned earlier, to recognize a miracle. We wouldn't recognize a miracle unless nature did what it did routinely and consistently. Now, in order for there to be orderly natural laws that are consistent and precise, there has to be a being like God who created and sustains these natural laws. Why do they do the same? Why do these laws, why do they exist to begin with? And why do they do the same thing consistently over and over again? Because they were created and they are sustained by a mind. Laws come from lawgivers. And in order to do science, you need these laws. So I think at the very foundation, our ability to do science depends on a being like God, number one. Number two, it depends on how you define science, and that's a philosophical endeavor to define what science is. But if scientists are going to say that science only deals with natural causes inside the universe, then obviously, if you're going to define it that way, science can't say anything about a supernatural cause beyond the universe. So science couldn't disprove God or prove God, if that's your definition of science. But if your definition of science is any type of cause, when we're doing science, we're trying to find what particular cause caused a particular effect. We're going to look for natural causes first. But if we can't find a natural cause and we have evidence pointing to an intelligent cause, in other words, we don't just lack a natural explanation, that would be a God of the gaps argument, but we have positive, empirically verifiable evidence for an intelligent cause, then we can be open to an intelligent cause like God. Let me give you a quick example of this. If you're walking along the beach and you see in the sand, John loves Mary, you don't think the waves made that message or the crabs came out of the water and wrote that. You know that that's positive evidence for a intelligent being like a John or a Mary. A messages always come from minds and all your prior experience, right? So whenever you see a message, you're going to say it's positive evidence for intelligence. The same thing is true when it comes to life. We find a message in every living thing that's thousands or even billions of letters long. All the letters are in the right order. It's called DNA. And so we don't just lack a natural explanation for DNA. We know that since DNA is a message, that's positive evidence for an intelligent being. So in that sense, when you analyze DNA, I think you're well within your rights to say, not only do we lack a natural explanation, this is positive evidence for an intelligent being.
Right. So, like you said, mentioned before, we need to look at, when we look at any such extraordinary claims, as it may be, we need to look at in the two aspects. First, is it possible? And as Jim Warner says, is it plausible? Is it rational to reach that conclusion? Because anything is possible in that sense. Right now, we could be dreaming of this conversation, but it's not plausible that we both of us are dreaming of this conversation. So, Dr. Frank, before we wind up this recording, I came across one article from one of the Azadai migrants based in India, Charles, and regarding the virgin birth, he was talking about what the virgin birth means, and he referred to certain scientific data and some research that has come up, which points, and this doesn't happen in humans, but this happens in other species, where the chromosomes can be dispatched from a single mother to the baby, such that an XY or an XX or a YY combination can be produced in a baby. So, like I said, this does not happen in humans, but this has been found to be taking place. It's an abnormality, and this has seen to be taking place in rats and other species. So, on the basis of that, given if it happens in a woman, and the virgin birth is a miracle, and one day we come to discover that this can happen in women, which is an extremely rare happening, an abnormality, would that come under a divine providence or a miracle?
Well, it would seem to be that it's predicted in the Bible, so it wouldn't be divine providence. It would be a miracle because it was predicted, and it also is stated that Mary had no intercourse with a man, and so it's meant to be a miracle, not just divine providence, it would seem to me anyway. And in some sense, as some theologians have said, that the virgin conception, it really wasn't a virgin birth. He came out just like everybody else. It was a virgin conception, was necessary theologically because Jesus therefore didn't have the sin nature, which would imply that men pass on the sin nature, not women. So, sorry, men, because Mary was impregnated directly by the Holy Spirit, not by a man. So Jesus didn't have a sin nature, and therefore he could be our perfect, innocent sacrifice.
Right. Wow, we have covered a lot of topic addressing the miracles, and to our viewers, to get your hands on Frank's book, especially, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist and stealing from God. And I believe this is something that you can find with students of Norman Geisler. Every student of his and his books, they have a very catchy title, because when you see, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, that takes you by surprise, because you never bring together faith and atheism in the same sentence. You always take that to be something of a flaw of the theist. And so, in all the books that Dr. Frank's, he expounds more and more of these topics about, especially in the book Stealing from God, the crimes, the points that can only make sense if there is a God. And also, if you go online, you can check it out at crossexamined.org. You will find a plethora of articles and videos. And on YouTube, they put out these 2 to 3 minutes of videos which they collect from student interactions that they take place in campuses. So it addresses some of the key questions that come in the Q&A, and also you can send it to your friends because it's just for 2 to 3 minutes. They will find it palatable to them in the time frame and sit and watch it. So thank you so much, Dr. Frank, for coming on the podcast. We are absolutely thrilled to have you, and we look forward to having you more often in the future.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for doing this. And there are, in addition to the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist book, you mentioned Lee Strobel's book on miracles. That's a good book.
Yep.
And for people who really want to get into this, Craig Keener's book, Miracles, is also very good. It's 2 books together. It's like 1,100 pages. So depends on how deep you want to get into this topic.
Right. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Frank, and thank you so much to our audience for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next one. God bless.